Before we get into this video on the brain, I'd like to ask you to subscribe if you like what you see, and that'll encourage me to keep going and take more of these videos. This illustration of the brain, human brain, is what one might see from the outside looking at it from onto the right hand side like this. The brain, when we looked at it in terms of embryology, developed as a series of lobes, and there were 3 lobes and 2 restricted areas. This is what becomes of that. The first lobe, the forebrain, is really a combination of all of these parts. That's known as the cerebrum. And looking at the cerebrum, I've sort of color-coded it into these lobes like this. You can see there's a brown area here, a blue area, a green area, and a pink area. This area at the back is actually the hindbrain. So we had a forebrain, a midbrain, and a hindbrain. This is what the hindbrain develops into, and it's called the cerebellum. What we're going to do in this video is explore these lobes a little bit and then take a look inside the brain at what specifically is going on with the cerebrum so that we can make some associations with how the brain controls what goes on in the body. This area down here, this is the brain stem, and this is the spinal cord here. We call the top of the spinal cord the brain stem, and when we look at it on the inside, I could be able to show you a little bit more detail there. So looking at the cerebrum, this is the area where all of the thought processes, integrated thought, and the connections are made with stimuli that come in from the outside into the central nervous system. Messages may come up the spinal cord and they're sorted into the correct area here, and they may come in from a cranial nerve and they get sorted into the correct area. This first area here is called the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is very specialized for things like integrated thought and a motor area, a sensory area right here. So this is a sensory area. Integrated thought occurs in here. So if you were doing math calculations in your head, this would be the part of the brain that's active to do those. Sensory area, so impulses come in from outside, they go to here, that's the frontal lobe. This part here that's in blue is the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe has a motor area right here. So you might start to make some connections here that the sensory area here, so you feel a sensation in the body and you want to move some body part to take care of it, and there has to be a connection to go to the motor area. The motor area would generate a nerve impulse to whatever muscle you want to move. So we have a frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, an occipital lobe, and the kind of thing that goes on in the occipital lobe is things like the visual association area. So if you think about it, cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve. The eyeball is located somewhere, say here. The optic nerve travels through the brain tissue around into this area here so that your visual association area can say, okay, I know what that is, you recognize that. And it may say, okay, we need to pick it up, so there may be an impulse goes to the motor area, and then you have a corresponding impulse that goes to a muscle. One more lobe here, that's this one on the side, is the temporal lobe. Now, temporal lobe being on the side, logically it deals with things like hearing, for example. On the left side of the brain, so I can't illustrate it on this picture, but on the other side, in the temporal lobe, there's an area called the Wernicke's area, and that's specialized for recognizing thought and speech, interpreting speech. So if you're learning a new language, for example, that Wernicke's area is a part of the brain that deals with that. But you can't really see too much in this picture until you get inside the brain and look at how the brain is arranged inside. So to try and represent that, think of it this way. The brain has two parts. There's a left part and a right part. And there's a central fissure that runs between the two parts. So inside here, there's actually a very, very deep, these are sulci, remember, and these other parts are the gyri. There's a very, very deep depression that separates the two hemispheres, if you like, the two parts of the brain. So this cerebrum has a left and a right part. If we were to take a knife and a preserved brain, for example, and cut down between the two lobes, there would be nothing there until we hit a structure in the middle, deep within the brain. And I've just changed this picture and I'll show you what that looks like. So let's just take a second here. So with this picture of the brain, I'm representing a brain as if we were to take it and having cut it through that central fissure. So what we're looking at here is quite simply the right side of a brain, looking at it from the inside out. So on this side, if that were my brain cut through here, you'd be looking at my right side of my brain. I've represented the brain in blue on here. This pink thing we'll get to in a minute, this orange thing we'll get to in just a second here. I want to point out one other thing that recognize there are 10 parts on here, and it is very possible to be encountering a question saying, describe the following 10 parts of the brain, or the functions of the 10 parts of the brain. So for those of you who are students, that would be a really handy question to know the answer to. We'll do that. We'll talk about all 10 of these parts of the brain and what they do. But first I want to point out to you that we still have these lines here, because this is the inside of that hemisphere. The brain's in two parts, remember. It's the inside. So this is really an outer surface of the brain. And these lines represent the sulci, those are the grooves, and the gyri are the ridges. So we talk about the sulci and gyri of the brain. We're talking about these ridges which are in between the grooves. Okay, so let's look at what we've got here. I'll just go through it very generally first. This is the brain stem, remember. The brain stem, spinal cord down here, the brain stem. We have the medulla oblongata here, we have the pons, pituitary gland, hypothalamus, thalamus, corpus callosum. This 8 represents all of this stuff up here. That's the cerebrum, remember. This is a ventricle of the brain, a chamber, and the cerebellum. So let's go through them one at a time and make sure we recognize what each one does and how it contributes to our overall functioning. Number 1 is the spinal cord. It brings impulses up from the peripheral parts of the body. So if there's something happening in your foot and there's an impulse going up to your brain, it has to come up here to get there. Spinal cord conducts impulses to the brain and away from the brain too, because it may be that the motor area is sending a message down to your foot so you kick or something like that. The number 2 on here is the medulla oblongata. We've already encountered the medulla oblongata. It's a reflexive center. It responds to internal messages in your body. For example, breathing. It's sensitive to the increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide and hydrogen gas and causes inhalation. This area here is the pons. The pons is sort of like a filtering center. So, for example, at any given time, you're subjected to lots of impulses, lots of information coming through to your brain, and the pons here sort of filters it out. For example, right now, if you're sitting down or your feet are on the ground somewhere, and until I say that, you don't feel it, you don't think about it. You can feel, oh yeah, I can feel the weight of my feet on the floor, or whatever happens, or one hand touching another hand. You can feel that now. But until I point it out to you, those impulses are being filtered out. And so they're coming up here, but wait a minute, your brain's got better things to pay attention to than that. So the pons is known as a filtering center. 4, pituitary gland. Pituitary gland with an S on it, because there is an anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary. It's a bilobed gland that hangs down from the brain. It secretes hormones. It is the topic of another video coming up in a while. 5 is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus coordinates what goes on with the pituitary gland. 6 is the thalamus. Now look here, these two words, thalamus and hypothalamus. You would think just because of their name is similar, they'd have something to do with each other. The answer to that is no, they have nothing to do with each other except location. Hypo is a prefix that means under. So if you look at here, the thalamus being here, the hypothalamus is under it in terms of location. Number 7 is the one that I've alluded to a couple of times, corpus callosum. If you think about the two hemispheres of the brain being separated to an extent, so you have a right side and a left side of your brain, the central fissure runs between them, and deep down inside that central fissure, deep down in here, is this corpus callosum. What it is, quite simply, is a very dense tissue that allows the two hemispheres to communicate with each other. So the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, but if you think about that, you'd be at a loss if you couldn't get one side to communicate with the other side. So just a simple thing like even walking, you have to be able to know what the left foot is doing at the same time as you know what the right foot is doing, because remember, the motor area is up here, the beginning of the parietal lobe, and the impulses to the left foot, the impulses to the right foot originate up here, and one on each side of the brain, so they interconnect through here. So you can control actions that require that sort of communication. 8 is the cerebrum. It's basically all the thinking stuff. So you have the motor area up here, the association area, thinking, so you have the sensory area here, you say, okay, now I got to do something about that, so it sends a message over to your motor area and sends a message back out again. So thinking and association area. So you make all the connections with the impulses. Number 9 is the cerebellum. And it has to do with balance and coordination. It's one thing to be able to move the left foot, the right foot, and the left foot to go to walk so that you've got that sort of communication through the corpus callosum, but you still have to be coordinated. They have to be, that fine motor skills that require one part of your body to know exactly what another part of the body is doing. And I'm going like this because I'm thinking of people who high jump and doing the Fosbury flop, and they're going to go up over backwards, and they have to know exactly what their feet are doing when their head's down here and their feet are up there. All over the body there are little things called proprioceptors. Nerve endings all over the body, and they send little messages up into the cerebellum here so that, okay, we know the cerebellum is coordinating the action of that one with that one. And you know exactly what different parts of your body are doing without even thinking about it. I mean, you know where your feet are right now. And you're not thinking about it. You know what your hands are doing, you're not thinking about it. If you want to touch the end of your nose, you can do that blindfolded, because you know exactly where your hands are in relation to your face. So that's all this coordination type stuff. It gets done through here. The impulses that generate that motion don't come from here. The impulses that generate that motion come from up here. This is where the motor area of the brain is, but those impulses are coordinated through here so that when they get out to your extremities, your peripheral parts of your body, it happens in a very coordinated fashion. We have one more part, 10. And 10 is this thing it's colored purpley color here. If you look at it, there's a chamber part here or a larger part here, and then it extends down here. What we said when we talked about the development of the neural tube, the development of the nervous system, it starts out as a tube and it's hollow. There's a lumen. And that's the space in here. This is the lumen of the spinal cord. It goes all the way down the spine to the bottom of your backside and up into here. This area here is a ventricle. And you may think of ventricles as being heart parts. Well, they are. But ventricle means chamber. So we have heart ventricles. We also have brain ventricles. And what it is a chamber that's full of what we call cerebrospinal fluid. So the chemistry of the fluid that runs up and down the spine here is one thing that's extremely important. So it has cerebrospinal fluid in it. And if you've ever known of anybody who's had a spinal tap, what they do with a spinal tap, quite simply, not up in this part of the body, but down in the lower back, they'll insert a needle in here and they'll withdraw some of this fluid, and they'll look at the chemistry of the fluid that's controlling or dealing with inside the nervous tissue here. So the only other thing I want to add to this is, how does this really work as far as your body's concerned? Now, if you can imagine, let's pick an example of some action that you might want to do. Catch and throw a ball while you run. Running to catch a ball and throw it. Okay, so let's just see what's happening here. If you're going to catch the ball, you have to be able to see it. So the optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2, picks up on the moving image of the ball through the air. It'll conduct that image through to the visual association area back here in the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe, knowing where it is, it sends a little message from here up to the motor area up here, in your beginning of your parietal lobe. That allows you to move in order to catch the ball, and that area will send a message down, coordinated by the cerebellum, to your legs and to your arms to allow you to catch the ball. And it's constantly getting that information. So all that stuff, because thinking, which is up here more, and making the association so you know what's going on with your body. In the next video, we'll look more closely at this area here, the neuroendocrine control center. And then we'll leave the brain a little bit and we'll deal more with regions of the spinal cord and types of neurons and what that's all about. Remember to subscribe. Thank you.